Now we worked on the newsletter registration. Let's now work on the comments area for our individual events. Here the goal is to again add an API route which accepts incoming data, this entered data, and then for the moment just logs it to the console, but which in addition also returns data for GET requests. And the API route should be dynamic because the ID of the event to which the comment belongs should be encoded in the URL. That was part of the instructions. Hence, I'll add another API route in the Pages API folder, and I'll use square brackets in the file name here, since it will be a dynamic API route. And I'll name my dynamic path segment identifier here event ID, because that is what should be encoded in the URL. Now we could leave it here, but I will actually create that file in a comments folder so that the full API route to reach that file and to execute the code in that file will later be /comments/some event ID. Because I think that is easier to read and makes more sense than just /some event ID. There it's not clear that this refers to comments. If the full path is /comments/some event ID, that makes more sense. And of course there's /API in front of all of that. So therefore here we can again define our handler function, which gets a request and a response, and export that inside of this event ID file, like this. And now in there we need to handle two different cases. The case that it's a post request which we get, and the case that it's a get request. Hence again, we can check the request method here and check if it's post and then do something, and then also check else if, or in another if statement thereafter, if request method is get. And if it's something totally else, we do nothing, and therefore we don't return a valid response, but that's fine because for this application we don't intend any other usage. So now here we support post and get requests, and we can now implement the different logic. Now in both cases we need to know for which event we should add a comment or return the comments. That's why we made this dynamic. And hence, before we dive into any if block, we can already retrieve the event ID from request query. That's what you learned in the last section. This is how you can get access to the concrete value entered in the path as a value for this placeholder. So here it's request query.event ID because I chose event ID written like this between my square brackets. If you chose a different identifier here, you have to choose a different property here. Now with that I get my event ID though. Now what we want to do differs on which request method we have though. If it's a post request, we get data for a new comment. So then we want to add server-side validation here, because I mentioned that you can't trust client-side validation. Therefore here I will add server-side validation and check if the entered data is correct. For this we first of all need to extract the entered data, so the data which is part of the incoming request, from the request body. And here I expect to get 3 pieces of data, which I'll pull out of the request body with object destructuring. I expect to get the email address of the user who left a comment, the name of the user, and then the comment text. And therefore, of course, when we later send a request from the client, so from the front-end code, we need to make sure that we include exactly these 3 properties into our request data. That's our responsibility later. With that, we'll then be able to extract it like this from the incoming request body. And then we can add validation logic. We can check if not the email address includes an @ symbol, or if we don't have a valid name, or if name, if we trim it, is equal to an empty string, which would also be invalid, or if we don't have a text, or if the text, if we trim it, is equal to an empty string. If any of those conditions here is met, the input is invalid, and then I want to return. I don't want to continue with the function execution, and I then also want to send back a response with a status code of 422, which stands for invalid input, and some message of our choice. For example, we could say invalid input. Of course, you could add a more elaborate validation, but that's good enough for now. So with that, we validate the user input. As a next step, after this if check, but still in the post method if check, we wanna do something. And for the moment, again, I'll just console log the data which we received. So I will console log email, name, and text here. We will soon do something more useful, but for the moment, that's it. Thereafter, I want to send back a response with a status code of 201, because we will have created a new comment. We don't actually do it here, but we will soon do so, and send back some data in JSON format, where we could send back a message of added comment. And actually, we can create a new comment object here, a new JavaScript object, with some random ID. For the moment, I'll just use the current date timestamp to create a dummy ID. We will also soon have a better ID, but for the moment, that's good enough. And then add email, name, and text here as fields in that object. And therefore, then, as part of the response, not just send back the message, but also the comment that was created, that new comment. So that we create it here and we send it back. And actually then we can also log that new comment here instead of the individual inputs. So that is then my actual logic for this case, for the post case. Now, if we get a GET request, we want to send back a list of comments. At the moment, we have no such list because we have no data source, no database yet. And therefore, at the moment, I will just create a dummy list of comments, which is an array where I add a couple of dummy comments with an ID, a name for the user, and an email address like this, and then also the comment data. Actually, we don't even need to add an email address because we will not use that on the front end anyways when displaying the comments. So here, let's maybe also name this text. And then let's add a text like a first comment here. And then add a second comment with C2 by manual, where I say a second comment. And of course, it shouldn't be a fist, but a first comment. Okay, so that's my dummy list of comments, which we will later replace with an actual list coming from a database. But for the moment, it's this. And then we send back a response with a status code of 200 with some JSON encoded data, where we have our comments, which is just this list of dummy comments for the moment. And that's the API route for the comments feature. Now let's send the appropriate requests from the front end.